In this video, I'll be talking about the menstrual cycle. So I made two previous videos that introduces hormones and reproduction, talking about um, the male and the female, the hormones they make, the basic purposes of these hormones in terms of sexual development and reproduction. So check those out if you want to if you want to be sure you understand why a man becomes a man, and all those things, and talk about karyotypes. So if you want to make sure you understand the basics before we get into the menstrual cycle, check those videos out. They will help. So first, let's just go straight into it. So the menstrual cycle. Do you know how long the menstrual cycle is? So yes, it's about a month. So, but specifically 28 days. Obviously, this number does vary a little bit. Sometimes you might, it's possible to be a bit longer than that or a bit shorter than that. But 28 days is pretty much 99% of the time. So this, do you know what this image is about? So yes, this is the female reproductive system. So before I start explaining the menstrual cycle, so to make sure that all of you that you know all the parts of this, all the important parts. So what do you think this part right here is? So this part right here is the ovary. It's the most important part, in my opinion, of this whole um, of the female genitalia, because it is going to make the crucial hormones to allow the egg to be made, because the egg is made here, the female gamete, the female sex cell is made there. This part right here, this is like this part right here is basically called the endometrium, and it is the thing that during the menstrual cycle is filled up with blood and nutrients to be able to be prepared to receive the baby and be able to take care of the growing embryo there. The uterus is the last important one, and it's the inside right here. This is where the baby will grow during its lifetime. For 9 months, this is where it will happen. The last important one that I didn't label is this tube right here. This is called the fallopian tube, and it's basically the tube through which, after the egg is made, the egg will travel through that tube to reach the uterus. So let's go now into explaining the menstrual cycle. So we know, do you know what day one is? So it's 28 days we said, right? So what happens during day one? Day one. So day one is when what people would consider as a period is the bleeding. So it's when the bleeding happens. So that signals the start of the period. I always thought that it was the end of the period that this happens, or the end of the menstrual cycle because it's reached the end. But it's kind of a combination of the end and the beginning, because it represents, this day one sort of represents the end of the cycle, but also the beginning. And why? So this happens during day one. So why does it bleed? So the reason why it bleeds is because when the egg had traveled and done all its things and came here, there was no sperm. No sperm ended up coming in, which means that the egg didn't meet up and it couldn't be fertilized. So the body will know this and be like, okay, nothing happened this month, we got to reset it. So then it will start. Remember, I told you this, the endometrium is filled with nutrients and blood and all that throughout the cycle. So now all this blood will get let out. So this kind of would deflate in a way. You can think of this as like deflating and the egg coming out. So the egg is going to leave, and all the nutrients and blood will leave along with it, because now it wants to reset the cycle. Now it wants to make another egg to restart the process until one day the egg will meet the sperm. And remember, only one egg is made during the menstrual cycle. Because when you think of a man, millions and millions of sperm are made, right? But for the menstrual cycle, only one egg is made. So if that egg is not fertilized, it will have to reset itself. So that's day one. So day one, bleeding starts. It's a way to signal the end and the beginning of the menstrual cycle. Then what happens? So we know we want to make another egg now, because this egg left pretty much. This egg is now out. So how are we going to make another egg? So in order to make anything happen, you need a hormone. And we know hormones are made here, right? So I'm just putting this, by the way, it's just a little diagram to explain what this looks like on the inside, sort of. So just try and visualize that. So you can see this is where the egg is going to come out. So I'm trying to put that on top so you can visually visualize it. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit to make sure you can see it. Okay. So here, ignore the numbers, the 1, 2, 6, 8, 5, and 3. Ignore that. Just look at these. Look at this growing process. So we know, so what I want to show you here is this outside part is the follicle, and the inside right there is the egg. So the follicle is holding the egg inside. But we know this is what we want to let happen. We want to grow a follicle with an egg inside. But what hormone is going to allow that to happen? So let me show you. So the hormone that's going to allow that to happen is FSH. And remember, FSH is made in your pituitary gland. It's not made here. It's made in the brain. Okay? So it's made in the pituitary gland, and it will tell this hormone is responsible for letting the follicle develop. It's the follicle stimulating hormone. And the follicle has the egg inside, so that's very important, obviously. So just remember it now. So it will make the follicle develop. So I'm just pointing at the follicle. But the problem is the follicle doesn't develop fast enough with just FSH. So somehow another hormone has to come into play to speed up this process. And that hormone is called estrogen. The difference, though, is we know estrogen is made in the ovary, so it's made from here. But where specifically? So specifically, it is made by the follicle. So you can think of that like the FSH is making the follicle develop, but the follicle knows itself that it's not developing fast enough, so it needs to help FSH. So the follicle is going to help FSH by causing estrogen to be made. And estrogen is a hormone that will tell FSH, it has like a relationship with FSH, okay? So it's going to basically motivate FSH and make more FSH. So basically FSH doesn't make enough, doesn't cause this to happen fast enough. The follicle will then make estrogen, which will then motivate or make more FSH to speed up the process, okay? But that's not the only function estrogen has. Estrogen also has a very crucial function other than that, and that is the repairing of the endometrium. So remember now, the endometrium now bled, so it lost all its nutrients. So now the job of estrogen is to repair it. It's going to repair it, start to repair it. It's going to slowly get it ready to receive another egg, okay? Okay, after this, what happens? So we know now the egg is starting to get ready. Estrogen levels are about to peak. They're getting at their highest because now it's trying to help FSH, right, and help this. So eventually, oh yeah, by the way, this relationship between estrogen and FSH is called positive feedback, okay? That means positive feedback is a mechanism that allows things to become more. So when estrogen has a positive feedback, it basically makes more FSH. It's allowing it to happen faster and faster. If you hear the word negative feedback, that means an example of negative feedback would be if estrogen kind of inhibited FSH. If estrogen was like, nope, I don't want more FSH, that would be negative feedback. But in this case, estrogen wants more FSH. So you call that positive feedback. That's a key thing to remember. Remember that estrogen and FSH have a positive feedback relationship because they're working together. Think of positive feedback as working together to make more. And the negative feedback would be like not working together. It's making less. Okay, so like I said, estrogen reaches the peak as the follicle starts to develop and becomes here. And when estrogen reaches the peak, this peak causes LH to be released, another hormone. And do you remember where LH is made? And so remember, just like FSH, LH is made in the brain. So when your body recognizes that estrogen has peaked, the brain, the pituitary gland, will make LH, okay? And why do you think it will make LH? So remember, the egg, just to put some perspective, around the middle of the cycle, day 12-ish, the follicle has reached its peak. It's like ready. I'm ready to be released, okay? But 2 days later, it is released during day 14, so exactly half the cycle. So at exactly half the cycle, when this thing is developed and estrogen has peaked, the pituitary gland knows this and then causes LH to be released. And we know LH, causes the follicle to leave the egg. It's gonna let the egg go. So that's, if you can remember it like that, the L as in let the egg go. So think about it, the egg is in there, in there, and then eventually on day 14, LH will cause, that hormone will cause the egg to be let go, and now it's released. Okay? Almost at the end, almost here, bear with me. So now the egg is released, it's starting to travel. But we know as soon as the egg is released, remember in my previous video I said the corpus luteum is now made. And the corpus luteum is basically the scientific name for the follicle. So the follicle is this whole thing with the egg inside. So the corpus luteum is basically the follicle without the egg. And that makes sense because the egg just left. So now the follicle is like by itself. So this thing here is called the corpus luteum. The egg without, the follicle without the egg. And LH will cause this thing, this hormone. LH not only causes the egg to leave, but it causes the corpus luteum to like repair and remake itself, because you see it's starting to be regenerated to be able to make another follicle with another egg. So LH will make it repair itself and also make sure it has nutrients inside, because now the baby is about to be made, so the baby will try and get nutrients from everywhere, including the corpus luteum, okay? But now we're missing one hormone, remember? The other green one. And you'll see why the other green one is pretty important as well. So as soon as the egg is released and the corpus luteum is now formed, the corpus luteum will make progesterone. Because remember that progesterone is also made from the ovaries. So you can see where in the ovaries. It's from the corpus luteum. But why would it make progesterone? So the reason why it makes progesterone is because an egg has already been released, right? So you don't want any more eggs to be made. Because if you have, imagine women were able to make many eggs, that means they can have like millions of babies at once. So they only want to make sure there's one egg that can be fertilized. They only want to make sure one egg can meet a sperm and make one baby. They don't want to make millions, right? So your body has this mechanism to allow only one egg to be made. And that is because progesterone, after the egg is released, inhibits both FSH and LH. So this hormone basically has negative feedback with FSH and LH. And negative feedback means not working together. So they're basically annoying each other. They're preventing each other from working. So the progesterone inhibits FSH and LH to do their job. And by inhibiting FSH to do its job, it means you're inhibiting a follicle to be made, because FSH causes a follicle to be made and an egg to be made. So by doing that, no follicle can be made. But also it's preventing LH. So if by some means FSH manages to make a follicle, LH will not be able to cause the egg to be released. So the egg will forever stay in the ovaries, and that means that you won't have another egg, and only one egg will stay. So a lot of people, by the way, take something in order to not get pregnant. They take progesterone because progesterone will prevent them from making any eggs in the first place. So in the normal system, in your normal body system, your body makes one egg and then progesterone is made to prevent any more eggs from being made. But if you take progesterone, you won't be able to make any eggs at all. So that's what people do in order to prevent pregnancy at points. So they'll take pills that has progesterone inside. So just like estrogen, progesterone doesn't only have one purpose. So the one purpose we just saw is negative feedback with FS and LH. It prevents them from working. But it also has another function, and that is to work with estrogen to develop this endometrium. Make sure all the nutrients is ready, make sure it's all repaired to receive the egg. Okay? So now everything has received the egg. So now everything is ready. We've made now sure everything is ready, the whole process happened, now the egg is here. But no sperm again. So what's gonna happen? We know we know that progesterone and estrogen causes this thing to be ready. So now that the body knows there's no sperm, the body will cause the drop of production of progesterone and estrogen. So they will make sure that these hormones aren't there anymore. And if these hormones aren't there anymore, then obviously this thing won't be able to be maintained. And so by the drop of these hormones, you will start to bleed, and all the nutrients and all the blood will leave because these two maintain it. So as soon as the body causes the drop in these hormones, it will start to bleed, and you will lose it along with your egg. So that's coming back to day one again. And now again, as soon as it leaves, FSH will be made in order to make the next egg, and this cycle repeats and repeats and repeats forever. Now, I hope you understood all of that. I hope it made sense. This is definitely one of the more difficult topics to understand, but if you can visualize this diagram and just remember the process through this image, it should be much easier to understand. So I'm not just going to go here to, if you have a question on the exam, I recommend you to answer it sort of like this. There's 5 major steps, and if you can include most of these keywords, there's no reason why you can't get very good marks. So I just want to make sure I use all the correct words, and that's why I have this. So the step 1, the endometrium of the uterus shed and leaves the body through the vagina. At the same time, FSH is made. So that's step 1, remember? The endometrium will start bleeding and the blood will leave through the vagina. At the same time, FSH is made. And why? Because FSH causes the development of the follicle. Okay? The follicle will now secrete estrogen. Make sure you always, I didn't put the function of FSH here, but make sure after you say FSH is made, say what it does. So say it's a follicle stimulating hormone, it causes the follicle to develop. Then the follicle that is developing will secrete estrogen, as we saw. Estrogen will have positive feedback with FSH, and so FSH will, so this will cause the egg to be developed faster. FSH will decline after a while because otherwise more than one egg will be made. And estrogen will eventually reach, also repair the uterus lining. Remember, estrogen has 2 functions, FSH and estrogen. So just remember also when the egg is developed, FSH will slowly get less to make sure no more eggs are made. Because you only want 1 egg, remember that. So step 3, I said 1, but I meant once. So once estrogen levels reach a peak at day 12, so estrogen levels peak, then this will cause LH to be released from the pituitary gland. So LH, when LH peaks, ovulation will happen. And basically ovulation is a scientific word for the egg being released. So remember this word, ovulation. It's good to use. Literally a science way of saying the egg is being released. Step 4, LH will now stimulate the empty follicle, so that's the corpus luteum. The empty follicle will now form the corpus luteum, which is basically going to make progesterone, remember? Because progesterone will prevent another egg from being made. And it also stimulates the thickening of the endometrium. So when I say progesterone inhibits FSH and LH, I mean that they have negative feedback. And I said that already in the diagram. The last step here, if the egg is not fertilized, because obviously if the egg is fertilized, you can't have the menstrual cycle anymore because now something is growing, so the blood can't leave, so you can't have a period. That's why when you're pregnant, your menstrual cycle ends. But if you don't get pregnant, then you will bleed and you will repeat the whole cycle. So if it's not fertilized, the corpus luteum will degenerate and basically degenerate to form a new follicle. The fall in progesterone. Oh yeah, and at the end of the day, when all these hormones, estrogen and progesterone fall, these will bleed, right? But also remember progesterone, when there's progesterone, FSH can't make an egg because it's inhibiting it. So also when estrogen and progesterone falls, it means that FSH is not inhibited anymore, so it can now continue to make an egg. So yeah, that's what I say here. Since progesterone falls, FSH is no longer inhibited, and now a new egg cell can be made. Now that's completely it for this whole menstrual cycle. It does seem complicated, but try and follow these steps that I explained clearly. Rewatch the video and make your own diagram, whatever that's good for you to memorize it. But I hope you learned something at least in this video. And in my next video, I'll basically what I just explained. I'll get some IB questions multiple choice and long answer and go with you through them to show you what the IB expects when they give you a question like that.